Hello guys, welcome back to another Elden Ring video, and today we're looking at something completely original that hasn't been done 100 times before, an Arcane Bleed build. I know some people are going to be rolling their eyes when they see this video, but I need to have one on the channel, at least just so people can stop confusing my Dex video for a dedicated Bleed build. So if you've been here before, you know how we do it. My builds are more like a template where we look at various ways for you to play them. I'll first go over some of the more creative ways to play an Arcane build, at least in regards to melee specifically, before covering the overused quote unquote OP variants you've likely seen 100 times before. Now when it comes to an Arcane/Bleed melee build, the first thing you need to take into consideration when finding a weapon you want to use is, does it have native bleed, and can the weapon be manually scaled with Arcane through occult affinity? Or does the weapon naturally scale with Arcane and have native bleed? Answering yes to these questions is going to give you your best options for a max bleed Arcane weapon build, but there are exceptions which we will get into. So we'll start with my second favourite weapon for this theme, which is the bloody Helice, and we're starting with this one because it perfectly represents the foundation of a high Arcane scaling weapon with high bleed build up, whilst offering a slightly more creative way to approach the combat due to the weapon's moveset and weapon art. The basic moveset does fantastic damage on its own, but the weapon art, Dynast's Finesse, gives you a lot of defensive utility in that it's incredible at evading incoming attacks whilst offering you the choice to follow up with big damage and very good stance break potential. To optimize this build for this weapon, I recommend a white mask be worn when using any bleed weapon, and for your talismans, Ritual Sword Talisman is your highest damage modifier at 4 HP. Millicent's Prosthesis is optional for you, but for me it's necessary because the +5 to Dex is going to be essential for me to use certain weapons with higher Dex requirements due to min-maxing my stats, which I'll talk about towards the end of the video. You'll notice that the bloody Helice requires 19 Dex, and without the talisman I have 17, so this talisman is also raising attack power on successive attacks. Now if you already have the base amount of Dex required in your stats, you would probably use the Rotten Winged insignia in place of it. Now you might ask, why not just use both? Well, you can, but the other two talisman slots require two different talismans. So on this weapon we're going to be using Shard of Alexander, as this is greatly going to boost the damage on the follow-up attack from Dynast's Finesse weapon art. And then we of course have the Lords of Blood Exaltation, which is going to be a staple for any bleed build. Keep in mind, to proc this buff you do need to be in very close range of the target when the bleed proc goes off, though this buff can also be activated by applying bleed to yourself through the Seppuku Ash of War, which we will also get into later. Now for the next weapon, this is where things get far more interesting. Now these personally are my favourite weapons for this build, and it's the dual wielded Antspur Rapiers. Now to get two of them, you're either going to have to get the second one from New Game Plus, or you can at any time get any weapon you want via trading. Now if you don't have anyone to trade this to you, or any other item in this build that you might not have, you are welcome to join our Discord where we have a trading channel. Links will be provided in the description and pinned comment. But moving on, if we look at the scaling, natively this weapon is a strength/dex scaling weapon that doesn't have native bleed, but we can set a custom affinity on it, which in most cases would be occult scaling, which would make the weapon scale heavily with our arcane, which would give us much higher raw attack increase, but we don't want to do that in this case. What we want to do is give it the blood affinity, so the weapon now applies bleed alongside its native scarlet rot. Now sure, we're losing a lot of raw attack power, but what we're gaining is insane levels of bleed build up on a very fast attacking dual wield moveset, alongside the scarlet rot, which by itself isn't affected by arcane unlike bleed and poison, but it can be used to proc another attack buff, which we do by swapping out the Shard of Alexander for the Kindred of Rot's Exaltation, which works exactly the same as the Lord of Blood's Exaltation, only it's for poison and scarlet rot procs. Now this weapon isn't going to do as much damage as something like the Scavenger Curve Swords, which maximise attack power alongside the insane bleed build up, but what you are getting is a far more unique playstyle that also offers you a lot more utility. For one thing, you can put a parry Ash of War on this weapon type, and there's nothing cooler than having a fast attacking dual wield moveset that applies DOT effects via rot, burst proc effects via the bleed, and the ability to have an on-demand parry. It feels like an extremely complete package, and if you don't like the parry, you can put something on it like Bloodhound Step and just dance around enemies whilst furiously poking them to death. And if all of that wasn't enough, because it's a thrusting sword, you can even use it with a great shield and safely poke from behind it whilst guarding. And I almost forgot, your offhand or both weapons can utilise the Seppuku Ash of War to buff yourself, increasing both attack power and bleed application. So yeah, that's why this is my favourite weapon for this build. But moving on, purely for the theme of bloody elegance, the dual Hoslo whips. Perfect in the sense that they both come with native bleed, and then we can custom set the affinity to occult, allowing us to maximise both our arcane scaling as well as bleed build up. Now the downside to the whips is they can't follow up on critical down states, they can't backstab, they also won't have as much damage per second as, well, most of the weapons that I'm showcasing here, but what they do have, especially when combined with Bloodhound Step, is massive amounts of control over the engagement you find yourself in, simply due to the range and the massive amounts of stagger that the weapons do. You can really keep enemies at bay by utilising spacing better than you can with most other weapons. The fact that these weapons pass the New Game Plus Millennia test with relative ease is a testament to how effective they are at controlling space. And for the whips, your talismans would be the same as the others, although in your flex slot you can now combine Rotten Winged Insignia with Millicent's Prosthesis, because you won't be doing weapon damage or utilising rot. Next, if we really want to be unique, we can actually use greatswords in this build. So the Flamberge, for example, I never know how to pronounce Flamberge. It's perfect for this build because it has native bleed and it can be scaled with arcane, so I don't see many people running around with a greatsword on a pure arcane build, but it can be done and it actually works perfectly well. I'd recommend using something like Double Slash as an Ash of War, or any Ash of War that lets you do fast multi-hits to really take advantage of the bleed application. The only thing I don't like about this greatsword is, unfortunately, it doesn't have all of the fantastic poke roll catches that you'd find on other greatswords such as the Claymore, so it's not the best moveset for PvP specifically. That said, if I was going to use this weapon in PvP, I'd probably throw on the Giant's Hunt Ash of War and carry a claw weapon with Bloodhound Step in my inventory, so I have a backup to chase down enemies. Speaking of which, I don't actually have any max upgraded claws, but they would be perfect for this setup. You throw on occult scaling and prioritize successive attacks with your talismans. You could also make a jump attack build with claws, but I'll get into that a little bit later. So now it's time to include the stupid quote unquote broken playstyle that you've probably seen 100 times before, but I feel the need to include it so people don't go on about it if it's not in the video. So it's the dual Scavenger Curve Swords, scaled for occult affinity, Seppuku Ash of War on both weapons, Claw Talisman, which enhances your jump attacks, the White Mask, the Raptor's Black Feathers chest piece, which enhances jump attacks, and yeah, even without jumping, you'll delete anything in the game susceptible to bleed. But with the jump attacks in this setup, it's about as close to broken as the word broken can mean. I think it's a word that's kind of overused by YouTubers with their clickbait gimmick videos, but in this case, yeah, the damage is pretty silly, and it's not exactly balanced in terms of what you're actually doing to achieve this level of damage. So yeah, play that build if you want, it's entirely up to you, you bought the game, so have fun with it. Now, for the stats, it's going to be completely up to you based on what weapons you preference. For example, you'll notice I didn't talk about the weapons such as Rivers of Blood or Eleanor's Pole Blade, not only because I'm sick of those weapons to be honest, but to optimize them you'd want to have more emphasis on Dex, supported by Arcane. So you could even do an even split of 40-40 for Dex and Arcane, or you could go like 60 Dex and 30 Arcane if you wanted to prioritize the AR increase. I don't know, I haven't really made builds for those weapons specifically, but this weapon is a pure Arcane build build. So with a starting class of Samurai at level 150 in New Game Plus, I'm stopping at 50 Vigor in PvE, which in New Game Plus is more than enough. I don't need 60, which is the main soft cap. If however I was primarily PvPing with this build, I would of course want 60. Mind is 25, which is enough for me to spam my abilities. The only thing I can't do with this level of mind is summon Black Knife Tish, which is my favourite summon with this build. I just don't really use summons that often, but if I really did want to summon her, then I would just throw in an FP talisman or activate a rune, and that would give me enough mind to summon her. Endurance is the final dump stat, so we're going to come back to this. For strength, it's going to be the minimum requirement of any weapons we want to use, which for me is 18. Now for dex, this is the important part. I go for the minimum requirement needed for all the weapons I want to use, but based on using a talisman that gives me +5 dex. So that's 17, which with the talisman gives me 22, and 22 is the minimum requirement I need to wield any of the dex weapons I like. Now what this min-maxing does is it allows me to invest fully in Arcane, going all the way to our major soft cap of 80, and then I dump whatever's left into Endurance, which for me is going to be 22, okay? Obviously if you're a lower level, you'd obviously be running with far less Arcane, and if you were PvP, same thing. If you were like level 125, you'd be running even less Arcane because you'd probably want to bump up your Vigor to 60 as well. For my physic mix, generally I'm going to be running with Thorny Crack tier, which boosts consecutive attacks, alongside a Dexterity Not Crystal tier that gives us +10 dex increase, which is a nice little boost considering all of our weapons scale with dex in some way, especially the weapons such as the Antspur Rapiers, which aren't set to occult affinity, so they're scaling higher with dex anyway. Now if I wanted to do something weird like use a Great Shield with a higher strength requirement for specific bosses, then I'd throw on the Strength Knot tier so that I can equip that Great Shield, and you also have your defensive options with Opaline Bubble tier and Crimson Bubble tier, and of course the best tier for leveling or protecting high rune stacks, Twiggy Crack tier, which by the way you don't have to have active before you die. You can die, drop your runes, equip this, use it, then run back to your runes, and if you die on the way back to them, it won't matter, they'll still be where you dropped them the first time. For fashion, obviously we have the white mask as a staple for its benefits, but I like to pair it with the Hoslo's armor, which fits that bloody Elegance theme, and the all-knowing gauntlets and greaves, which in my opinion match the dark grey fabric of the white mask, alongside it all being relatively lightweight considering we don't have the highest stamina. I have no problem staying at medium weight with any combination of weapons with this setup. And that's pretty much the build, guys. As mentioned earlier, you're welcome to join our Discord if you're looking to trade, co-op, or just hang out. And if you like this video, please hit the thumbs up because that really helps me out. And if you're not already subscribed, consider doing so for more Elden Ring content coming soon. Okay guys, until next time, take care.